All right, philosophers, let's dive in. You're here for the lowdown on freedom of speech, and we're going deep with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's take on it.
It's a dense one, but super interesting.
Definitely. We'll hit the high points. Philosophical ideas about free speech, arguments for and against, limits, and even how the internet's changing the game.
Buckle up. It's going to be a ride.
So most people think free speech is important, but defining it, that's where it gets complicated.
Absolutely. The why and the where do we draw the line are the real debates. Even what we call it gets tricky.
Right. The Stanford Encyclopedia points out we use all these terms: freedom of speech, freedom of expression, even freedom of communication.
And they all kind of get used in the same way.
But each seems to highlight a slightly different angle, right?
Totally. Like speech seems very focused on actually talking,
Yeah, makes sense.
but expression opens up a whole other can of worms.
Ooh, interesting.
Think about art. A painting, a dance performance. Those aren't words, but they're definitely communicating something.
True. So where's the line? What even counts as speech in this context? Just words or something more?
The Stanford Encyclopedia makes a really interesting point about this. They say it's less about a strict speech versus action divide and more about the values behind protecting free speech in the first place.
Okay, so less about what you do and more about the why behind it.
Exactly. For example, think of a protest where people burn draft cards.
Okay, I'm following.
Is that speech or is that conduct?
Both.
Right. But to figure out if it should be protected, we need to ask, why are we protecting free speech in the first place? What values are we trying to uphold?
I'm seeing the nuance here.
Oh, huh.
So if the goal is diverse viewpoints, burning a draft card as a protest is probably protected because it's dissent.
Right.
But if we ban burning things for fire safety reasons, then burning a draft card becomes a different issue.
Exactly. The context and the intent matter a lot. And this leads us to all these different conceptions of free speech, each based on different values.
There are a bunch, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia.
Oh, there are tons.
But let's start with one that might really click for you as a philosopher. The listener theories.
Always down for a good theory.
Right, so listener theories, what's the deal?
It's all about the audience. When the government bans certain books, think about what that's saying.
Okay.
It's almost like they don't trust you, the reader, to make up your own mind about the content.
It does feel a bit patronizing when you put it like that.
Right. Like they think citizens are too fragile for complex or challenging ideas.
Not a great look for a government.
Totally undermines the idea of citizens being rational, critical thinkers. It disrespects listener autonomy.
Ooh, interesting term.
Yeah.
So it's not just about what's being restricted, it's about the message the government sends by doing the restricting.
Precisely. That lack of trust is a problem.
Big time. So let's unpack listener autonomy a bit more. What does that actually mean?
Basically, individuals have a fundamental right to access information and form their own beliefs without the government butting in.
Okay, I'm with you.
And this applies even if the government thinks those beliefs are harmful or dangerous.
Wow, okay.
It's about trusting people to make their own judgments about what they believe.
That's pretty foundational. This idea seems to be behind a lot of legal principles around free speech, right? Like content and viewpoint neutrality.
100%. Content neutrality means the government shouldn't restrict speech based on the topic.
Got it. So imagine a law banning all talk about climate change.
That would be a clear violation.
Yeah, totally. We don't care what you think about it, just don't talk about it.
Exactly. And viewpoint neutrality means the government shouldn't favor one side over another. So a law that only allowed pro-fossil fuel views on climate change would also be a problem.
So the government shouldn't control the direction of the conversation either, not just keeping themselves out altogether.
Exactly. And this goes beyond just politics. Anything where the government dictates what we consume, books, movies, research, it all touches on this. Banning a philosophical text, censoring art, it all raises red flags.
So even if you, as a philosopher, totally disagree with an idea, these listener-based theories suggest you still defend the right for others to hear it?
That's the core of it, creating a space where everyone can engage with diverse perspectives, even the ones they hate, and come to their own conclusions.
That's pretty radical. But I can see how it would be essential for intellectual growth. Challenging our own assumptions, engaging with ideas that make us uncomfortable. That's how we grow, right?
Right. That clash of ideas, even when it's messy, helps us refine our own thinking. It's not just about individual rights, it's about the collective good.
It's like the marketplace of ideas, right? Let the best ideas win out in a free and open competition.
Yes. Though, of course, the perfectly efficient marketplace is a bit of an ideal. We know people aren't always perfectly rational. Biases and misinformation can mess things up.
Wouldn't that make protecting free speech even more important? If people are susceptible to manipulation, then having a lot of ideas out there, even the bad ones, could help us become better critical thinkers.
That's a very strong argument. And it brings us back to that question of why we protect free speech.
Big question.
Is it about a perfect system for truth? Or is it about respecting individual autonomy and letting people grapple with the messiness and make up their own minds?
Heavy stuff. We only scratched the surface with the listener theories, and my brain's already working overtime.
There's definitely more to uncover, but it's a good start for understanding why philosophers see free speech as such a huge deal. It's about way more than just words. It's about fundamental values, individual rights, and what a free and open society even means. It really is fascinating, and there's so much more to explore. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the listener, but what about the speaker? Why is free speech so important from their perspective?
Okay, so now we're focusing on the person actually expressing themselves. What are the big philosophical arguments here?
Well, think about how much communication is tied to our sense of self. We express our thoughts, beliefs, values. It all comes out through speech. It's how we connect, share our experiences, participate in the world.
You're right, it's like restricting someone's speech feels like you're limiting more than just information. You're limiting their ability to fully be themselves.
Exactly. It gets at this deep connection between free speech and personal autonomy. When we can express ourselves freely, we're exercising our agency, shaping our identity. It's a kind of self-creation.
So these speaker-based theories are all about the individual's right to define themselves through expression.
That's the heart of it. It's not just about big political opinions. It's the small, everyday expressions that make us who we are. Telling a joke, writing a poem, even just venting to a friend, it all adds up.
It's making me think about kids, how they use language to try on different personas, experiment with ways of being. Seems like free expression would be huge for that kind of development.
Absolutely essential. To control what a child can say or think is to stifle that whole process of self-discovery. It can really impact their development.
For sure. And it's not just about speaking our minds, right? It's also about those conversations that happen when we share our thoughts with others. Like those late-night philosophical debates that can get so intense.
Oh, yeah, I know those.
They might not always be fun, but they push us to articulate our ideas, refine our arguments, maybe even change our minds.
You're so right. That back and forth is crucial. And it highlights another key aspect of speaker-based theories. This emphasis on intellectual growth through dialogue.
It's all about that friction. That's where the learning happens.
Precisely. It's like iron sharpening iron. When we engage with different views, even those that challenge us, we have a chance to grow as thinkers. And that's something free speech protects, according to these theories.
I see how these different theories connect. Protecting listener autonomy benefits speakers because it gives them an audience.
Yeah.
And open dialogue is important for both sides to really flesh out their ideas. They feed into each other.
That's a great observation. They're not mutually exclusive. They often work together.
Okay, so we've got listener theories focusing on the audience's right to access information and speaker theories emphasizing the individual's right to express themselves. What other angles do philosophers explore when justifying free speech?
Well, there's a prominent argument about the role of free speech in a healthy democracy. This one's interesting because it has both instrumental and non-instrumental parts.
So, on one hand, free speech is seen as a tool for achieving a well-functioning democracy. And on the other hand, it's seen as having inherent value in a democratic society.
Exactly. The instrumental argument is all about the practical stuff, allowing citizens to voice concerns, hold leaders accountable, participate in debate. I mean, how can we have government by the people if people can't speak their minds about how they want to be governed?
It seems like a pretty basic requirement for a system that claims to represent the will of the people.
Right. But then there's the deeper non-instrumental argument, the idea that respecting free speech is part of respecting people as democratic citizens, acknowledging their equal worth and their right to help shape their society.
It's like that famous quote, "What is essential is not that everyone shall speak, but that everything worth saying shall be said."
Yes. And some theorists take it even further, arguing that free speech isn't just important for democracy, it's like a fundamental part of it. You can't have true democracy without it.
So it's not just a tool, it's an ingredient. Like you can't bake a cake without flour.
Exactly. Think about deliberative democracy, for example. That theory says voting is just one part of a bigger process, a process that depends on open and inclusive dialogue where diverse perspectives are not just allowed but encouraged.
It makes me think about the idea of legitimacy. If people can't openly debate and challenge the decisions made by those in power, are those decisions really legitimate?
That's a huge question, and it shows how intertwined these concepts are: free speech, democratic values, legitimacy, and what it means to be a citizen in a free society.
I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all these theories. It's fascinating, but also a lot to process.
It's definitely a lot. And to add another layer, some theories blur the lines between these categories. We've talked about listeners and speakers, but what if we thought about free speech from the perspective of the individual as a thinker?
Ooh, I like that. So instead of separating the speaker and the listener, we're looking at the whole process, thinking, expressing, and receiving ideas as one big interconnected thing.
Exactly. One philosopher who's done some great work on this is Shauna Schifrin. She argues that free speech is crucial for people to develop and thrive as thinking beings.
So it's more than just expressing thoughts out loud. It's about how we use language to process information, understand the world, form our own beliefs.
You got it. Schifrin says that we often need to externalize our thoughts through writing, speaking, even just talking to ourselves to really grasp them.
It's like that saying, how do I know what I think until I see what I say?
Exactly. We think through language, and by talking with others, we challenge our assumptions, see new perspectives, and deepen our understanding.
This perspective suggests that restricting someone's speech isn't just about silencing them. It's about limiting their ability to think freely, to engage with the world as a rational person. That's a powerful idea.
It is. And Schifrin's theory highlights how connected thought and communication really are. We don't just think on our own, we think through language, and our ideas develop through interacting with others.
I see connections to the other theories here. This idea of the thinker seems to value the speaker's self-expression, the listener's right to information, and the importance of dialogue for both individual and societal growth. It brings it all together.
It does. It's a framework that really gets at the complexity of free speech. It's not just about protecting certain types of communication. It's about recognizing the fundamental role that free expression plays in our lives, as individuals and as part of a community.
All this talk about the value of free speech makes me wonder, are there ever situations where it's okay to limit it?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's easy to talk about free speech in theory, but things get much more complicated when we have to make decisions about where to draw the line in real-world situations.
Yeah, it's like we need to restrict some speech to actually protect free speech. But how do we even know where that line is?
It's a really tough question. You hear people say free speech is absolute all the time, but very few people actually believe all speech should be protected no matter what.
Right. I mean, there are obvious examples like threats or fraud or inciting violence, things where most people would agree restricting speech is totally justified.
Absolutely. So the real challenge is figuring out how to separate the speech that deserves protection from the speech that doesn't. The Stanford Encyclopedia lays out some useful categories here, which they call uncovered speech, covered but unprotected speech, and covered and protected speech.
Okay, those are some pretty dense terms. Can we break those down a bit?
Sure. Let's start with uncovered speech. This is communication that's not protected by free speech principles at all things, like making threats, perjury in court, or revealing classified information. These actions might involve speaking, but they don't really align with the reasons we protect free speech.
So these types of speech can be restricted without even bringing up free speech concerns.
Exactly. It's not about whether these actions are right or wrong. That's a whole other conversation. It's just that they don't fall under what we're trying to protect when we talk about free speech. Then we have covered and protected speech on the other end of the spectrum. This is most of what we say and hear every day: conversations, opinions online, artistic expressions, things that should be protected from government interference.
That makes sense. So what about that middle category, covered but unprotected speech? That's where things get really tricky,
That's
right?
a tough one. This is speech that has some value as free expression, but where that value might be outweighed by other concerns, like preventing harm.
So this is where we get into classic free speech dilemmas, like hate speech or misinformation that could be dangerous.
You got it. Take hate speech, for example. It's obviously awful, but it's still considered covered speech because it often involves expressing opinions about political and social issues. However, a lot of people argue that its potential to incite violence and discrimination is a good reason to restrict it.
It sounds like it comes down to balancing free expression against the potential for harm.
Exactly. This is what's known as the balancing approach. It recognizes that free speech isn't the only value we care about.
Mm,
Sometimes other values like protecting people from harm or upholding equality might be more important.
I get that, but doesn't this balancing get really subjective? Who gets to decide what speech is harmful enough to restrict?
That's a massive challenge, and it gets even more complex because there are different ways to think about this balancing act.
Like what?
Well, legally, it often involves weighing different rights against each other. One person's right to free speech might be weighed against another person's right to be free from harassment or discrimination.
That makes sense, but isn't it weird to think about balancing rights? Aren't rights supposed to be these fundamental, unchanging things?
You raise a good point. And some philosophers argue that we should be balancing interests instead of rights. So we consider all the different interests at stake, the speaker's interest in expressing themselves, the listener's interest in getting information, society's interest in preventing harm, and use those to define the scope of our rights.
So it's more about finding a practical solution that considers the real-world effects on everyone involved rather than just sticking to abstract principles.
Exactly. It's a nuanced approach, and it highlights the fact that finding the right balance is rarely simple.
And it's not just about deciding if the speech is harmful enough to restrict.
Right.
We also have to think about what could happen if we restrict too much.
Absolutely. A major concern is what's called the chilling effect.
Chilling effect. That sounds a little scary. What does it mean?
The chilling effect is basically the idea that even well-intentioned restrictions on harmful speech might discourage people from expressing themselves freely, even on perfectly acceptable topics.
So people might self-censor because they're afraid of getting in trouble, even if what they want to say is protected.
Exactly. This can happen because laws can be vague or because people overestimate the risk of getting punished.
That's true. The average person doesn't know all the legal details. They're not going to check all the laws before they voice an opinion.
Right. So the chilling effect is something we really need to consider when we think about restricting speech. We need to ask, will this actually stop harm, or will it create a climate of fear that makes people afraid to share ideas?
We're back to those unintended consequences again. Good intentions aren't enough. We have to think about the ripple effects.
Absolutely. And this leads to another important point that often comes up in free speech discussions: the danger of government abuse.
Right, because even if a restriction seems okay in theory, there's always the chance the government could use it to silence dissent or stay in power.
Exactly. History is full of examples of governments using censorship to control what people think and say.
It's like the classic slippery slope argument. Once you start restricting speech, it's hard to stop.
That's the worry. And that's why many argue that even when restricting harmful speech seems tempting, we have to be super careful about giving the government that kind of power.
So if censorship isn't always the answer, what other options do we have for dealing with harmful speech?
Well, one alternative that people often suggest is more speech.
Wait, more speech? Isn't that just going to make things worse?
Not necessarily. The idea is that instead of trying to silence harmful speech, we should fight it directly. Use counter-arguments, expose its flaws, and persuade people to reject it.
So fight fire with water.
Yeah.
Or maybe fight bad ideas with good ideas.
Exactly. This idea of counter-speech is really powerful. A lot of people think it's the most effective and ethical way to respond to harmful or offensive speech.
This counter-speech thing seems really important in the digital age, where misinformation and hate speech spread so quickly online.
You're right. The internet adds a whole new layer to how we think about free speech. It's not just about government censorship anymore. It's also about the role of these giant tech companies that control so much of what we see online.
It's a whole new world out there. These social media platforms are constantly trying to figure out how to moderate content, deal with misinformation, and stop harassment. It's a tough job.
It is, and philosophers are starting to ask some important questions about the responsibility of these platforms. Do they have a moral obligation to uphold free speech principles? Or should they actively remove harmful content, even if it means restricting some types of expression?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
They're private companies, so they can set their own rules, but they've become so influential that it feels like they have some responsibility to the public.
You've hit the nail on the head. And it's a debate that's only going to become more important as these platforms grow and have more influence over our lives.
We've covered so much today. From the philosophy behind free speech to the challenges of regulating it online, it's been quite a deep dive.
It has, and I think the main takeaway is that there are no easy answers when it comes to free speech. It's a complex issue with deep philosophical roots and challenges that are always changing.
Well said. So to our listeners, we leave you with this question to think about. In this world of algorithms, echo chambers, and online harassment, who's responsible for protecting free speech?
Mm.
Is it just the government? Or do these powerful tech companies also have a role to play? Something to ponder.
Keep those philosophical minds working.
And until next time, keep exploring.